For my part, beauty ravishes me wherever I find it, and I yield willingly to its delectable violence whenever it finds me. If you've been on BookTube or BookTok in the past couple of years, there's a very good chance you've come across the dark academia aesthetic. I mean, it's honestly impossible to avoid. But what even is dark academia? I mean, we all know what it looks like. Old-fashioned formal clothing, leather-bound books, and Victorian-esque buildings. But what is it actually? We may want to look to the books that get frequently recommended under the banner of dark academia to answer this question. And in this case, there's one book that I believe has had the most influence on this aesthetic or genre. We might even say it's the one that started it all. And that book is, of course, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I read this book pretty late compared to most people on the internet, and because of that, my experience was definitely influenced by the aura that exists around this book online. Because of how much it's talked about, I went into it feeling like I already knew what I was going to be dealing with and expecting it to turn out a certain way. When I finally read it, though, I was really surprised to see that the idea of dark academia that people have cultivated isn't even one that really exists in this book, and isn't one it's trying to promote. Similarly, I was shocked at how the way people talk about these characters, from romanticizing them to comparing them to real-life people, wasn't in line with how the book portrays these characters. So how did dark academia turn into what it is now? And why do people have such an intense fixation on these characters? In short, why do we like The Secret History? To answer that, I think it would help to start with the culprits, i.e. the reason dark academia has become what it is, which is, of course, the characters. To put it nicely, these characters are absolutely insufferable. They're horrible, deeply unlikable people, and it's sometimes hard to remember that because of how they're portrayed online. So let's really get into each of these characters and what we know about them. Side note, if I'm looking down a lot, it's because I'm looking at my script, which is like 40 plus pages long. So sorry guys, but I'm not memorizing that. So sorry if that is disruptive. But anyway, let's start with Francis Abernathy. I don't have much to say about Francis. I think he's one of the most straightforward, no pun intended, characters of the group. He's a pretentious trust fund kid. He tries so hard to present an image of sophistication and intelligence to others, which he doesn't really possess. He wears fake pince-nez glasses that he tries to pass off as real and loves to show off his car. Doesn't think rules apply to him, as he frequently parks in the faculty parking spaces and is too proud to pay off the fines he consequently receives. Francis's central struggle throughout the novel is his sexuality, not in the sense that he's struggling to accept it, but in the sense that he's unable to live freely. I think maybe the main reason people have for disliking Francis is that he continues to make passes on his male friends, even though, as far as we are told, they're straight. While this is obviously wrong and speaks to his belief that he's entitled to have whatever he wants, I think it's quite understandable why he acts that way. He knows his friends are the only people who won't out him and won't abandon him. In short, he knows there won't be any negative consequences to making these passes, so it makes sense why he would act like that. Which is not to say that Francis isn't worried about abandonment. We see him at multiple points express worries that Richard doesn't like him as a friend and that he'll leave him, which makes clear to us how badly Francis needs Richard and Charles and the rest of the gang, sans Bunny, in his life, because they're the only people who he knows he can be free with without being violently rejected, which we see does happen to him at the end, as his grandfather threatens to cut him off financially if he doesn't break up with his boyfriend and marry the woman they chose for him. I was kind of hoping for a different ending for Francis. Yes, I know the ending he got makes total sense, especially given when this book was written, but I guess I just wanted something different. I mean, sure, Francis doesn't really seem to be morally afflicted at the murder of the farmer and Bunny, at least until his suicide attempt, which can be a sign that he was more haunted by the murders than Richard let on. But still, I guess I have an inexplicable soft spot for him, and so I just wanted a different ending for him. This ending, however, does further highlight that Francis and some of the other characters was never taught how to provide for himself. He never needed to have a job, and so cannot fathom having to get one, even if it costs him his potential happiness. When Francis tells Richard about his grandfather threatening to cut him off, Richard asks him, "Can't you get by on your own?" To which he responds with a definitive no. Charles Macaulay. There's not much to really say about Charles. Like Francis, his character is written in a straightforward way, for the most part. Charles is a twin. He was raised by his grandparents after his parents died in a car crash. He's just as pretentious as the other characters, except that I think Richard's depiction of this is more favorable with Charles compared to the other characters. Charles's main struggle is, of course, his alcoholism, and though we're not explicitly told about the origins of this struggle, we're given many possibilities as to what it could be. Perhaps the excessive drinking started as a way to dull his guilt at how he treats his sister Camilla, or maybe his abuse of Camilla started as a result of his drinking. We're not really told. Another possibility that I think is worth exploring is Charles's drinking being a response to class struggle. At the beginning of the book, we know that Richard's parents are not well off and that he could barely afford to attend Hampton. So he's the novel's most overt way of exploring class struggle, since we see the other characters through his eyes. However, I think Charles is the novel's way of adding some nuance or of complicating this theme. Of course, we know that Charles and Camilla are well off, especially compared to Richard, but it's not until the end when Julian leaves that we find out that Charles's wealth is not a constant, sure thing like it is for Francis and Henry. When the characters find out they won't be able to graduate on time because of Julian's departure, Charles lashes out at Henry when he says he won't come back to class, suggesting that Henry doesn't care about graduating because being at Hampton isn't a necessity for him, and that he'd be fine and well off without it. This, of course, implies that this is not the case for Charles, which is something that, up until that point, we didn't really know. Before this point, the assumption made by Richard and us as an extension was that none of these characters, including Charles, need to be at Hampton. So Charles's drunken outburst adds more complexity to his character, as it makes us aware of an internal struggle that had been going on throughout the novel, which we'd been unaware of. Of course, we may have had a feeling that Charles wasn't as wealthy as he appears, since he asks to borrow money from Richard on several occasions, but we could have been inclined to chalk these up to forgetfulness. You know, rich, careless boy doesn't even bother to bring enough money with him or spend all that he had on him, because he knows he can rely on his friends for more. But now we know that Richard isn't the only one who is feeling like an outsider, like he couldn't relate to these characters. Obviously, Charles is more wealthy than Richard, but now we know that his wealth is more precarious than Francis and Henry, something that seems to be weighing on his mind, and which could be one reason for why he drinks so much. I think it could also explain why he tries to exert so much control over Camilla. If he feels like eventually he won't be able to support her and his family, or that he won't be able to sustain their lifestyle for much longer, it makes sense why this would manifest in an attempt to exert control in other ways. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that we don't know if Charles always intended on pursuing ancient Greek, or if Julian chose him. I am speculating here, but it's possible that Charles was thinking of enrolling in a more lucrative program, but was selected by Julian for this program. This could also explain why Charles was extremely impacted by Julian's departure, more so than Camilla, for example. Anyhow, I think Charles's ending was very fitting and in line with the struggles I've outlined. Someone who feels that he can't or doesn't want to be responsible for his family, runs away with his lover, proving that while you may be able to outrun your past, you can't outrun the guilt and shame that accompanies it. Henry Winter. I hate this man.
I never found you funny. I never found you entertaining. I never found you smart. I just found you annoying.
Here's the thing, I do think Henry gets too much of the blame when it comes to Bunny's murder, as if the rest of the characters aren't grown adults who could have refused to follow through with it. Don't get me wrong, Henry's a terrible person and he definitely is to blame for most of what happens in the novel. But I don't think he's this great mastermind that the characters think him to be. He deliberately keeps a diary while he and Bunny are in Italy, even though he knows Bunny will try to read it. He purchases the tickets to Argentina on his credit card. I mean, the guy's an idiot. He's definitely the most snobbish of the group, treating people outside his circle as less than, as mere obstacles in his way, as people whose property is his for the taking. Sure, he's intelligent, there's no denying that. I mean, he speaks multiple languages, he speaks multiple dead languages. That's certainly impressive, but he's not smart. He's also hard to read sometimes. For example, it's not clear why he even likes Camilla, aside from her being the only girl in the group. Our understanding of Henry depends almost entirely on how generous we want to be with our interpretation of him. Was he always planning on turning Richard in? Would he have followed through with killing Charles? Did he like Bunny at all? The answers to these questions really depend on you, the reader, and what you think of Henry, knowing everything that Richard tells us and how sympathetic you want to be to him when answering them. There's a lot more to be said about Henry, especially as it pertains to the ending, but I'll get into that in a later section, so for now, I'll stop here. Camilla Macaulay. Camilla. She really is the most difficult character to talk about, because she's the one who's hardest to wrench free from the grasp of Richard's narration. It makes sense why people's perception of this character is so one note, because once you take away or try to look past Richard's depiction of her, there's not much left, which I think is intentional. Through my research and generally being on dark academia sides of the internet, I found that there are two reigning perceptions of Camilla which are most popularly employed in people's discussions of her. Number one, Camilla is a manic pixie dream girl. And number two, Camilla is the academically smartest of the group. I'm here to argue that neither of these perceptions is true. Let's start with the first one, since it's quite easy to disprove. I hope that by now we're not strangers to the concept of a female character appearing as a manic pixie dream girl only because she's written through the perception of a male character who's infatuated with her. Tartt is obviously not the only author to write a female character like this. A more contemporary example is John Green's Looking for Alaska. I get the temptation to label Camilla a manic pixie dream girl, but textually speaking, I just don't think that's true. First of all, Camilla doesn't just exist to move Richard's story along. In fact, she doesn't even like him. Sure, she flirts with him, but there are reasons why she does that, which I'll get into. She has a story and a struggle of her own. It's just that Richard is too blinded by his obsession with her to notice it. There are things about Camilla that Tartt tells us, and others that we can infer about her based on context. I'll start with the more explicit things, such as the fact that even from the beginning of the novel, we're told that Camilla has a deep desire to live, to experience life to the fullest, which suggests that this is something she's not already doing. Of course, it makes sense why she feels this way once we find out that she's being abused by Charles. Being Charles's twin, she's also an orphan and relies primarily on her grandparents and family work for money. Because of that, I imagine it would be quite difficult for her to escape her situation or live on her own. Just like Charles feels a loss of control, so too does Camilla, except in her case, it's because her body and autonomy are being violated by Charles. I think it's this loss of control that is likely why she flirts with Richard, even though she knows she's not interested in him like that. Because it's nice to feel like you have some control over someone, especially when you feel you have no control over your autonomy or life. Now, for the things that we're not told outright, but that I think are likely or plausible interpretations for her character. I think it's likely that her desire to be free and to live is what attracted Julian to her and why he chose her. I mean, Richard himself even tells us that he believes Julian specifically chooses students who feel inferior and powerless and makes them feel superior. I think this desire of hers is also probably why she wanted to partake in the bacchanal, to lose herself, to be free, untethered from identity and any expectations placed on her. Something else we could talk about with Camilla is, of course, the fact that she's a woman. She's the only woman in the group. Throughout history, fields of study like the classics were typically a boys' club. And given when this book takes place, it's not unlikely to believe that Camilla feels like an outsider because of her gender. We don't get much insight into how she must feel being the only girl in the group because Richard's too busy ogling her, but I think there's one thing we can look at for possible clues, which is her appearance. It's noted multiple times throughout the novel that Camilla has a very androgynous style, which I think makes perfect sense. It's possible that this is simply her style, but it's also possible that she feels she has to maintain a more traditionally masculine way of dressing to gain the others' respect, to make them take her seriously. In short, to make them forget she's a woman. Additionally, Richard loves to remind us that Camilla has a hairstyle which makes her look like a boy. I have two possible interpretations for why that could be, aside from maybe it's just her style. The first is that it's another way of distancing herself from traditional femininity as a way to blend in with the guys, and the second is that it may be a way of protecting herself. Towards the end of the book, Richard tells us about the time he found out about Charles's abuse of Camilla. He explains, "She held up a piece of the light hair near her temples. Underneath was a scabbed spot about the size of a quarter where someone had, apparently, pulled a handful of hair out by the roots. Good God, Camilla, Charles did this?" So perhaps another reason Camilla keeps her hair short is because it makes it more difficult to pull on, or maybe she hopes that by appearing more traditionally masculine, it might deter her brother from her or make her less attractive to him. But that is just a theory I have. Aside from her appearance, I think the way Camilla acts in the few instances we're told about shows just how interesting of a figure she really is. For example, she was the only one out of the group to go with Henry to check that Bunny was really dead. Richard recalls, "She'd climbed down with Henry and was back at the top before him, the rest of us waiting at the edge. She took a handkerchief from her pocket and wiped her muddy hands, not looking at any of us really. Her hair blowing back light against the sky, and her face a blank for just about any emotion one might care to project." I think this is a fascinating addition because it can be understood in so many different ways. Number one, Camilla's the only one who goes with Henry because she feels this pressure to fit in with the group, to prove that she deserves to be there, that her being a woman doesn't make her any less brave than the others. Two, Camilla's the only one who goes with Henry because she loves him and wanted to be with him at this moment. And three, Camilla's the only one who goes with Henry because she really is the bravest, most fearless of them, after Henry. All three of these theories are plausible. They just depend on your understanding of this character. The way Richard retells this incident is worth analyzing, not just for this piece of information, but also for the descriptors it gives us about Camilla. For instance, why was she back at the top before Henry? Was it an inability to stomach looking at Bunny's body any longer? An inability to confront Henry at this moment? Furthermore, why doesn't she look at the other characters? Does she fear that looking at them would expose her fear? That she isn't as fearless as she wants them to think? Or does she fear that looking at them would expose her ambivalence at the murder? There's so many possibilities, but of course we don't get a straightforward answer. So it's possible that I'm doing what Richard himself said, merely projecting my own feelings onto the seemingly blank canvas that is Camilla. But if Camilla is supposedly a blank canvas for most of the book, I think who she is at the end of the book is less so, which can especially be felt in the scene when Richard asks her to marry him. When he does ask her, she says no, claiming, "I can't just pick up and go to California," which is where Richard now lives. "My grandmother is old. She can't get around by herself anymore. She needs someone to look after her." When Richard suggests moving back to be with her, she says, "You should see the way I live now, Richard. My Nana's in bad shape. It's all I can do to take care of her. And that big house, too. I don't have a single friend my own age. I think it says a lot that, unlike Charles, she doesn't run away. She doesn't shrink away from responsibility, even if it potentially costs her her happiness. The vulnerability she shows in this moment makes her so much harder to glamorize. Yes, sure, we still don't know what her true intentions or motivations are, but I think it's enough to know that she does have them, that she's not just a shell of a person. It's also in this encounter that Richard finally sees Camilla as she is. No rose-colored glasses, no dream girl fantasy. He explains, "She closed her eyes, dark-lidded, dark shadows beneath them. She really was older, not the glancing-eyed girl I had fallen in love with, but no less beautiful for that. Beautiful now in a way that less excited my senses than tore at my very heart." It's this difference in the way Richard now views her and her refusal to marry him that I think concretely proves that she does not exist in this story simply to please Richard. She may be a flawed character, if not a complexly written one, but she's certainly not a manic pixie dream girl. So where does this idea of her being one come from? If you look up The Secret History or Camilla on Pinterest, or look at The Secret History content anywhere on the internet, chances are the portrayal of Camilla you've come across is that of the cool, aloof, mysterious girl who's a big reader but obviously only reads highly acclaimed literature and classics. In almost all photos of her, she's typically seen sporting a blonde bob, which, as I've already established, is also not canon. Out of all of the main characters, Camilla's online depiction is the one that strays the furthest away from her canonical depiction. It's not that Donna Tartt wrote her as a manic pixie dream girl, although we could argue that she's a bit underwritten. I think it's that we, the readers and online literary community, have turned her into one, which brings me to the second popular perception of Camilla. Now, I'm not saying that I've seen anyone explicitly say this, but it's definitely implicit in the way people depict her. As I said, the online image of her depicts her as an academic inspiration, someone whose mysterious aura is a testament to their intelligence, someone who we take book recommendations from or try to model our aesthetic after. But again, this idea of her is not canonical. Canonically, Camilla is someone who frequently neglects her studies, who we never see read. It's suggested multiple times that Henry is the biggest reader of the group. She doesn't express that she wants to continue in academia after finishing her degree. At the end of the novel, she tells Richard that she can't even remember the last time she read a book. So where did people get this idea of Camilla that she's an academic weapon and a cool girl reader? Because to me, it's entirely fictitious. Don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing that she's stupid. Clearly, she is intelligent and her proficiency in ancient Greek is impressive. But that alone does not an inspiration make. We have, perhaps unintentionally, stripped away all aspects of her personality, like her questionable morals and indifference to murder, and all the struggles that would complicate the aesthetic we've cultivated. It's no wonder that most of the popular depictions of Camilla do not feature who she is and what she looks like at the end of the book, and don't accurately depict her hairstyle, because doing so would ruin the cool girl fantasy. Thus, the online Camilla was reduced to a manic pixie dream girl to fit the image we've created of her. I love a hot and smart girl in academia as much as the next person, and I know how valuable it can be to see a character like Camilla in a traditionally male-dominated space. But I think it's time we all admit that she's not as cool as we think she is. None of these characters are, and she's not an exception just because she's in a certain position that may look appealing to some of us from the outside. It's easy to want to look up to Camilla, to believe that she deserves to be in Julian's class, that she's smarter than her male counterparts, that she's mysterious and quirky. We need Camilla to have these qualities that we project onto her, because otherwise, what does it say about us when we glamorize and put her on a pedestal? Richard Papen. I think Richard is probably the easiest character to understand. He's our narrator, the person we likely most relate to or identify with, our YN character, if you will. He also doesn't shy away from showing us who he really is and what he truly feels, with very few exceptions. I think his unreliability as a narrator mainly exists to paint the other characters in a better light rather than himself. Though, of course, painting the other characters in a more favorable light reflects better on him, since it makes his liking of these people and culpability in their crimes potentially more justifiable to us. Bunny Corcoran. I mean, what is there to say about Bunny that the characters haven't already told us? Bunny adds life to the group. If you've read Tartt's other novel, The Goldfinch, Bunny really reminds me of Theo's mom, in the sense that when she dies, you really feel her absence throughout the rest of the novel. And that's not a spoiler, by the way. She dies on like the first page or like in the first chapter. Even though we don't get to spend too much time with her before she dies, her death leaves a void in Theo, but also in the book itself. And you as a reader feel it too. I felt the same way with Bunny, even though I despised Bunny when he was alive and was quite honestly waiting for him to die. Once he was gone, I felt something missing from the novel. Suddenly the characters and the plot was a lot duller, and I couldn't really put my finger on why, on what it was that I was missing, until I realized that it was Bunny's presence. I missed his dumb, made-up stories, his silly jokes, him challenging the other characters and calling them out on their pretentiousness, him getting on their nerves. I missed him as a character and what his presence added to the setting and the story. This is not to say that I found him to be likable. I want that to be clear. But I thought he was more interesting than the rest of the group. Maybe that's because he was so absurd, his manners so exaggerated, or maybe because I don't care if a character is unlikable as long as I find them entertaining. Who knows? But I do know that Bunny's death exposed how empty and boring the other characters are, which is not to say that he isn't also those things, and how symbiotic their relationship really was. By this I mean that Bunny cannot exist without these characters. Without them, he wouldn't have the finances to support his lifestyle, and he wouldn't have people who make him look rich by association. If we were to follow him without the other characters, we'd likely grow bored of him quite quickly. Similarly, these characters cannot exist without Bunny. They are utterly insufferable and boring without the lively energy he brings to the group. They don't have much to talk about and aren't interesting enough on their own to carry the story, to make us forget he's not there. I find it interesting that the romanticization of these characters doesn't typically extend to Bunny. Like, even in the posts people make about the secret history, I find that Bunny is frequently excluded from the group, even though to me, he is the most compelling character. So we've now established that they're all horrible people, maybe to varying degrees, but all horrible nonetheless. So why do we like them? Well, that's easy. Tartt tells us why herself. I mean, she quite literally spells it out for us. Before I properly get into discussing the themes, I wanted to spend some time dissecting the epigraphs because I think they bring up a lot of important points that really guide our reading of the novel, obviously, hence why Tartt included them.
I inquire now as to the genesis of a philologist and assert the following. Number 1, a young man cannot possibly know what Greeks and Romans are. And number 2, he does not know whether he is suited to finding out about them.
I would like to argue that, like the young man in question, the characters and younger readers are mistaken about what Greeks and Romans are, which is why a lot of readers didn't realize that this book is satire. By this I mean that, like the characters, we tend to glamorize the Greeks and Romans, placing them on a pedestal and viewing them as figures to look up to, which is why we're confused when we find out that the Greeks and Romans we're also really dumb when it comes to a lot of things. It's hard for us to reconcile this fact with our perception of Greeks and Romans because of how much we idolize them. Similarly, because readers idolize or glamorize these characters so much, the obviously satirical parts of their characterization, as well as their obvious stupidity, are taken literally or overlooked to justify our idealization of them. This leads me to the second point. Due to the lack of self-confidence or belief in oneself that we tend to have as young adults, we don't let ourselves question Greeks and Romans, i.e. these characters, out of fear that we're not as smart as they are. Like the young man, we don't know whether we're suited to finding out what Greeks and Romans really are, which is why a lot of readers look to these characters or false idols to follow. The book also comes back to this epigraph at certain points, like when Julian asks the group, are we in this room really very different from the Greeks or the Romans? And for all their logic, who lived in more abject terror of the supernatural than the Romans? To me, these questions read as attempts to make us, the readers, realize that we're really not very different from the people or characters we idolize. The second quote included in the epigraph reads, "Come then, and let us pass a leisure hour in storytelling, and our story shall be the education of our heroes." We all want our story to be the education of our heroes. In one way, we want our heroes to hear our story and think that we're cool. Although it's interesting because I don't think this applies to creators' relationship to Donna Tartt, meaning I don't think bookish creators who heavily rely on dark academia or secret history visuals in their content are doing so to impress Donna Tartt. So it's worth asking, who are our heroes? In another way, telling our heroes our story is sort of our perverse way of crying out for help. We want our heroes to analyze our story, to look beyond its veneer and to recognize our pain, to fulfill our desire to be saved by them. For the characters, Julian is quite obviously their hero, and their story will become his education by the end of the book. The characters wanted so badly to be embraced and saved by him, but instead he recoils from them after finding out the truth. I tend to equate physical beauty with qualities with which it has absolutely nothing to do. I see a pretty mouth or a moody pair of eyes and imagine all sorts of deep affinities, private kinships. It's no secret that beauty, or rather people's obsession with beauty, is a major theme in the book. I would argue that Richard's obsession or preoccupation with beauty makes him unintentionally dehumanize the other characters. He only sees them as shiny, beautiful things, not real people. I mean, hell, when Bunny first asks to shake Richard's hand, he's taken aback by what he calls this sudden glare of attention. He says, "It was as if the characters in a favorite painting, absorbed in their own concerns, had looked up out of the canvas and spoken to me." This is not the only time he does this. Later, he describes them like this: "They were magnificent creatures, such eyes, such hands, such looks." The way he describes them reminded me a lot of the way Tartt talks about beauty in a talk for the John Adams Institute. In this talk, she says, "If you're talking about the beauty of a flower or a beautiful person, it's horrible because one, it's given completely capriciously. One has no control over it. You have it or you don't really. So there's cruelty in the way that it's even doled out. Also, it's ephemeral. I mean, that's the horrible thing about it. Even to the living things that are lucky enough to be given beauty, it lasts for a very short time. And in manufactured objects, in paintings or in books or in poetry, beauty is also cruel because it's very remote. It's figures on a Grecian urn. These figures are cold. I mean, they have no sympathy for us. These nymphs dancing around a vase." Richard views the group as figures on a Grecian urn, and you could argue that they're aware of how he feels about them, and that they even enjoy being viewed in this way. I'll talk about this more later, but I think the way beauty is emphasized in Richard's descriptions of the group tells us that we cannot fully trust his depiction of them, because he's not able to be objective when it comes to them. Beauty comes up more explicitly in one of Julian's classes, where he tells the group, If we are strong enough in our souls, we can rip away the veil and look that naked, terrible beauty right in the face. Let God consume us, devour us, unstring our bones, then spit us out reborn. Richard later writes in his journal, "Beauty is terror. We want to be devoured by it, to hide ourselves in the fire which refines us." I'm very intrigued by this ripping away of the veil because I don't think any of these characters ever truly managed to do that. I think the closest they got was perhaps the bacchanal, but as soon as that was over, it was back to concealing their true selves, back to the pretend game. A side note, because I don't know where else to put this, but I simply must bring it up. Do you guys think that if these characters existed in real life, they would have tried to shift to Hogwarts during the 2021 lockdown? Because I think they would have. In the same John Adams Institute talk, Tartt mentions that the original title of the book was The God of Illusions. She goes on to say that she had to change it because the publisher didn't like it and ended up naming it after a book written in the 6th century by the Greek historian Procopius, which was also called The Secret History. Her explanation of what Procopius's secret history is that Procopius was a historian during the reign of Justinian and that he wrote down the state-sanctioned accounts of what was going on. However, she says that as soon as Justinian died, Procopius then wrote the secret history, which is the account of what was actually going on during that time. So that gives us a clue of what Tartt's The Secret History is supposed to be. A look behind the curtain at what this group of people who might appear worthy of admiration from afar are actually like. However, I also think that you can classify Richard's narration as both the glamorized, watered down, or fake account of events, as well as the real truth of things. This is what the book is about in a lot of respects, is the difference between appearance and reality, because nothing in this book is really what it seems. The narrator is fooled again and again, or is deluded again and again. I think we constantly switch between the two, appearance and reality, because it takes Richard a while to see through his idolization of the group, but it's up to readers to think critically and try to discern when both we and Richard are being fooled. In some ways, Tartt makes it easy for you to make this discernment because she constantly has Richard blur the boundaries between reality and dreams. This is something I fully missed in my first read of this book and only noticed when I went back to reread it for this video. But it's how many times dreams are brought up or things are described as dreamlike. I'll put a couple examples for you on the screen, but there are many, many more. If I went over them all, we'd be here all day. And this also happens with the word illusion. For example, Richard admits that he was charmed by a conversation he has with Julian, despite its illusion of being rather modern and digressive. Tartt always makes sure to drop these little clues that show us that nothing is as it seems. Even when Richard visits Camilla and Charles's apartment, he remarks, "On the mantel of the fireplace," which I later discovered was inoperable. It's such a small detail, but it really goes to show that nothing is real. Frances wears fake pince-nez glasses, and even the fireplace is fake. She also never lets us linger in the sexiness of the aesthetic. For instance, the chapter right after Henry confesses to Richard about the bacchanal and the murder of the farmer begins like this. "When the lights came on and the circle of darkness slipped back into the mundane and familiar boundaries of the living room, it was as if I'd switched on the lamp after a long, bad dream. Blinking, I was relieved to discover that the doors and windows were still where they were supposed to be, and that the furniture hadn't rearranged itself by diabolical magic in the dark." She makes sure that as soon as Henry's account, which is asceticized to make his words more palatable, is over, that we're immediately dropped back into reality, so that we do not lose ourselves in the narrative he crafted and forget that, hey, murder is bad, actually. The same thing happens again when Richard reads the newspaper article on the farmer's murder, which describes his corpse as having been mutilated, which up to that point we'd only had Henry's toned down account of what had happened. At a later point, Henry says, "People don't pay attention to 90% of what they see." which felt to me like a tongue-in-cheek joke at the readers because, of course, we too haven't really been paying attention. We too have been seduced by the aesthetic. Remember what I said at the beginning of the video about how the aesthetic that people associate with this book doesn't even entirely exist in the book itself? Well, I noticed this the most during the scene where Richard goes to the campus party. He explains, "The music was insanely loud and people were dancing and there was beer puddled on the floor and a rowdy mob at the bar." This line is the one that first made me consider that the idea we have of the characters and the scenery isn't even accurate. I mean, beer puddled on the floor and a rowdy mob at the bar? I don't know about you, but that is not at all the imagery I would expect in a dark academia book, especially based on the aesthetic people have curated for it online. This singular line sort of feels like when you're watching a period film, but one of the actors has iPhone face. You know what I mean? Something is just not quite right. And I think it's because this aesthetic is more commonly associated with like old UK buildings and classy parties, not US college parties with rowdy, sweaty, drunk frat boys. But I think knowing that this is the environment the story and the characters exist in makes their behavior seem all the more out of place or fake or pretentious. There's a juxtaposition there that's easier to ignore in a book since there's no visual element until you get to lines like these that so perfectly bring you back to reality. Or, I don't know, maybe we, the readers, are aware that this is the world the characters exist in, but because it mirrors our own world so closely, one we may want to escape, at least for a while, we've convinced ourselves that these characters don't also belong to it. Which is kind of exactly what these characters do as well. They too seemingly want to escape their environment and live in their own world. Richard even says this at one point. The idea of living here at Francis's house, of not having to go back ever again to asphalt and shopping malls and modular furniture, the idea was so truly heavenly. This distinction he creates between Francis's house and things like shopping malls, etc., makes it seem like Francis's house is a dream world, separate from real life. Of course, inherent in Richard's statement is his desire to stay at the house with the rest of the group, so his statement then acts as a way of showing us how strong the group's bond is, at least from Richard's perspective. But I don't think that this is actually the case. At several points, Richard slips up and reveals certain things that make you question whether these people even like each other. For example, when Richard reflects on the weekends they spent at Francis's house, he says, "Now that I think about it, it seems while we were out there, we drank almost constantly." I'm not drink shaming them, but I think it says something when a group of people either can't or don't want to hang out sober together for extended periods of time. It almost feels like their friendship is mitigated through substances. Another slip-up occurs when Richard's talking about Henry and he says, "I had never thought Henry handsome. Indeed, I'd always thought that only the formality of his bearing saved him from mediocrity." This line I find compelling because you can't be totally sure whether Richard is being honest here or if this is another example of his unreliability. I say this because Richard makes this comment at a point when he is pissed at Henry and thinks that he's betrayed him to the FBI. So this could fully just be Richard backtracking to save face, especially because this completely goes against the way Richard had been describing Henry throughout the book. But I like that Tartt plays with us like this. It's fun to try and figure out what is real and what's not. And this is why I said at the beginning that your interpretation of these characters depends on how generous you want to be to them. The next point I'm going to touch on frequently throughout this video, and it's the difference between our perception of the group's academic standard and the reality of that standard. A crucial pillar of dark academia, which came as a result of this book's success, is the academic excellence of the relevant group of characters. Often you'll see people online propping up this group as academic inspirations or super smart people, when that's not really who they are. And Richard tells us this explicitly. He explains, To be honest, none of us, not even the brightest of us, were destined for academic achievement in subsequent years, Francis being too lazy, Charles too diffuse, and Henry too erratic and generally strange. Camilla was no different. Based on the aesthetic that has come out of this book, you'd never think that this is how the character's relationship to academia really is. This contrast is made clear again when Richard talks about Hampton's alumni magazine, saying, "The alumni magazine was depressing. Hampton graduates never seemed to do anything after they got out of school but start little ceramics shops in Nantucket or join ashrams in Nepal." This completely breaks down the idea that myself and I'm sure other readers had too of Hampton up to that point. I genuinely thought it was a place for like ivy-bound kids, the way that these characters act. I want to end on this quote that Richard says about Bunny because I think it perfectly describes the entire group. It was a strange feature of his, Bunny's, personality that the less one actually knew him, the more one felt one did. Viewed from a distance, his character projected an impression of solidity and wholeness, which was in fact as insubstantial as a hologram. If you step back far enough, however, the illusion would click in again, and there he would be, bigger than life, squinting at you from behind his little glasses. A character like his disintegrates under analysis. It's almost infuriating that Richard never applies this description to the rest of the group because they're all exactly like this. They would all disintegrate under analysis because they don't have any substance. And we'll come to realize this when Richard gets close enough to them and the illusion starts to shatter. In an interview for Today, Tartt references Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, a book by J.F. Martel, as one of her influences when writing The Secret History. Even though it hadn't been published yet when she wrote The Secret History, she says, "It articulates very clearly some of my ideas about art as a meeting place for ideas otherwise inexpressible and a conduit to realities beyond the human." She also specifically highlights this quote from the book, "True beauty is not pretty, it is a tear in the facade of the everyday, a sudden revelation of the forces seething beneath the surface of things." Now, this may remind you of the beauty is terror quote that we just went over. I did read Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, and I actually did find a lot of similarities between the ideas J.F. Martel discusses and the ones Tartt presents in The Secret History. Beyond this one quote that I mentioned, I'm not sure what ideas exactly Tartt was influenced by, as she didn't go into more detail than what I mentioned, but I do still want to go over the quotes that stood out to me, because I think they're quite noteworthy. Martel opens the book by presenting the central idea he's going to be discussing, saying, "Since the dawn of the current era, art has been under threat. In the place where it belongs on the cultural landscape, two idols stand like golden calves, demanding worship. Pornography, the use of aesthetics to manipulate through desire, and propaganda, the use of aesthetics to manipulate through fear." I'll be talking more about pornography as I think that one is more relevant to The Secret History, but I'll come back to it in a second. Martel goes on to explain what he sees as the difference between art and artifice, stating, "Artifice forgoes the revelatory power that is art's prerogative in order to impart information, be it a message, an opinion, a judgment, a physiological stimulus, or a command." Here, I want to step away from the world of the book for a second to talk about how the aesthetic surrounding it is being used on social media. I'm sure you've also come across posts on social media that heavily rely on mimicking the book's aesthetic or the group of characters, so much so that people will point out these comparisons in the comments. Something about these creators' posts always felt off to me, but I couldn't put my finger on why that was. But I think Martel explains it perfectly. He says, "Artifice isn't improper because it is immoral, but because it hitches the aesthetic on intentions originating from outside the aesthetic realm." These posts feel so artificial because they're blatantly using an aesthetic that, as we've established, isn't even entirely real, to sell you, the viewer, something, whether it's an idea or a product. Proper art moves us, while artifice tries to make us move. Furthermore, these posts are rarely uploaded satirically, and because of that, they exude fakeness because they're so removed from what the book is actually about. In the John Adams talk, Tartt says that The Secret History is a book about dictatorship and about political power, but you would never get this idea from the dark academia or the secret history posts that people make. These posts feel disingenuous to me because I always get the impression the creator is trying to grow a following through making people envy or desire them, through trying to convince them that they have something in relation to the aesthetic presented in the book, which the viewer doesn't. And here I'm obviously not talking about all dark academia creators. In fact, I think the type of creator I'm talking about is becoming a minority as the dark academia aesthetic slowly moves out of the trend cycle. But I thought it was something important, so I wanted to still mention it. This is where I want to start talking about Martel's definition of pornography again. He says, in pornography, not necessarily sexual, things are presented in such a way as to make us want to possess or consume them. I believe a lot of the creators who heavily use the dark academia aesthetic, as well as the characters in this book, employ pornography, as Martel defines it, to make us desire and thus like them. For example, when Richard asks Henry if bacchanals are fundamentally sex rituals, he responds, "There was a certain carnal element to the proceedings, but the phenomenon was basically spiritual in nature." I think Henry mentions this carnal element because he can sense that this will make Richard, if not more envious that he missed out on this experience, then it's certain to distract him a little from the murder Henry's about to confess to. Henry knows he doesn't even have to go into detail about what exactly they did, sexually, I mean, because putting the kernel of that idea in Richard's head is enough to make him curious, to make him want these characters even more. Martel mentions something in relation to this that I think is thought-provoking. He says, paradoxically, the more a pornographic work succeeds in turning the people it depicts into things, the more the viewer himself is objectified in turn. This is because the kinetic power of Artifice inheres precisely in replacing concrete individuality with an abstraction. Artifice compels us to judge all things solely against the needs and wants it imparts. As we are led to judge, so we ourselves are judged. The more Richard venerates these characters and seeks to emulate them, the more he loses himself trying to chase an abstraction. And the more we admire these creators and seek to have what they do, the more we risk losing ourselves trying to emulate an illusion. On the very first page of chapter 1, Richard tells us that he thinks his fatal flaw is his morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. This establishes two things. One, it explains why Richard was attracted to the Clique, and two, it tells us not to trust his subsequent descriptions of the characters and events because we can never be sure if he's describing things accurately or imbuing them with a glamour that isn't there. Tartt really is not vague about the fact that Richard is unreliable. He has always been a storyteller, that is to say, a fabricator. He tells us, on leaving home, I was able to fabricate a new and far more satisfying history, full of striking, simplistic environmental influences, a colorful past, easily accessible to strangers. Richard explains that he sought to dazzle others with his fictive childhood, which really calls into question why he's telling us the story at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In one of Richard's first mentions of the Clique, he describes them as an arresting party, one that suggests a variety of picturesque and fictive qualities. Again, those two words, fictive and picturesque. Their use here I find quite noteworthy because it tells us that the main thing which initially attracted Richard to the group is their picturesqueness or their aesthetic. And more importantly, that their appearance also suggests something about them is fictitious or fake. The thing is, I find that Richard sometimes doesn't even realize that the things he tells us about the group expose their true characters and thus highlight his glamorization of them. For example, Richard mentions, Henry and Francis argued interminably about how far the soldiers in a Roman legion had stood, shoulder to shoulder, as Francis said, or, as Henry maintained, 3 or 4 feet apart. Which made me pause for a second because why are all their conversations about things that don't matter or are not like real life current things. In a lot of their conversations, they're always talking about things that are suspended from reality, almost like they're living in their own little bubble. But you'd think they'd be more interested in politics given how smart they supposedly are, right? But no, as Richard tells us, none of them were the least bit interested in anything that went on in the world, and their ignorance of current events and even recent history was rather astounding. And I don't think he realizes that this would make us view the characters unfavorably, because he mentions these things in such an offhand way and without judgment, of course. But this happens quite often, this not withholding pieces of information that paint these characters in a bad light. Like when Richard tells us that Henry told the group, "I'd love to have so much land that from where I lived I couldn't see a highway or a telephone pole or anything I didn't want to see." None of these characters have an adverse reaction when one of them says something like this, but they're kind of like alarm bells for the reader that the glamour Richard imbues them with is unearned. It's not long before Richard admits to us that he had been viewing the characters inaccurately. He says, "It was months before the gloss and mystery of newness, which kept me from seeing them with much objectivity, would wear entirely off, though their reality was far more interesting than any idealized version could possibly be." Although this admission comes fairly early in the book, I don't think he fully stops his glamorization of them from then on. I think it's something he constantly has to fight throughout the book until the end, when he realizes that he has a fatal tendency to try to make interesting people good. As I'm sure some of you have noticed, I haven't brought up a certain character that much up until this point, and that character is of course Julian. That's because I wanted to talk about him in this section. This is not to say that I think Julian is the only Dionysian figure in the book, as I think there are a few, but I think he's the most obvious one, so I'll start with him. Julian Morrow. Dionysus is the master of illusions, who could make a vine grow out of a ship's plank, and in general enable his votaries to see the world as the world's not. Going back to that first epigraph, I think it perfectly sums up the essence of these characters and why they were so easily and deeply attached to Julian. The characters are the young man. They're young, lost, insecure, and desperately looking for guidance. They don't believe they can be smart or great on their own, which is why they latch on to a figure like Julian. I never understood why, towards the end of the novel, Richard kept telling us that he had been somewhat glamorizing Julian in his descriptions because he admired him too much and, even after everything, couldn't bear to have us see him as he really is. I didn't understand this because, to be honest, I never found Julian to be charming in the first place, like at all.
I never found you funny. I never found you entertaining. I never found you smart. I just found you annoying.
Because he is most obviously the person they're performing for. And he is also very obviously feeding off of that praise and idolization. He's extremely manipulative right from the start, taking advantage of the insecurities each of these characters have, while letting them think they're the ones who are in control. In a conversation with Julian where Richard opens up to him, with more candidness than usual, he says, "I was convinced that I was acting of my own volition." I believe this line was added in hindsight by future Richard after he comes to see Julian for who he really is. In this same conversation, Julian tells Richard, "I'm afraid my students are never very interesting to me because I always know exactly what they're going to do." I think this line works in two ways. One, it makes Richard think that he's not like Julian's other students, because why else would Julian tell him this if not to signify that he is special? And two, it encourages performance. Julian knows that Richard and the others is dying to impress him, and here he's practically telling him that to do so means always having to be one step ahead, to be unexpected, surprising, to be constantly performing. And Richard's not the only one performing for Julian's approval. The rest of the group do the same thing. When they invite Julian to dinner, for example, Richard explains, 5 minutes before Julian arrived, they might be slouched in the living room, but the instant the doorbell rang, their spines would straighten, conversation would snap to life, the very wrinkles would fall from their clothes. This attitude goes beyond simply wanting to impress their professor. No, they look up to him in a way that you would a godly figure. At one point, Henry even describes Julian as a divinity. And when Bunny writes his letter to Julian, he ends it by saying, "Please help me. This is why I wrote you. You are the only person that can." Like someone begging their god for absolution. In the John Adams talk, Tartt explains why the characters view Julian so highly, stating, "Julian is really very much a moral neutral, but he's someone upon whom they all project this desire for a father, and really kind of refuse very strongly to see him for who he really is." This is something that Richard himself admits in the book when he says, "It was Julian who had grown to be the sole figure of paternal benevolence in my life, or indeed of benevolence of any sort. To me, he seemed my only protector in the world." It's incredible that Julian is able to make them view him this way so quickly, but I think it shows just how vulnerable and in need of support these characters are, that they latch on to the first authority figure who makes them feel like they're special. Richard himself finally realizes that this is what's happening at the end. He says, "I could say that the secret of Julian's charm was that he latched on to young people who wanted to feel better than everybody else, that he had a strange gift for twisting feelings of inferiority into superiority and arrogance. I could also say that he did this not through altruistic motives, but selfish ones, in order to fulfill some egotistic impulse of his own." Let's look at the infamous first line for a second. "The snow in the mountains was melting, and Bunny had been dead for several weeks before we came to understand the gravity of our situation." I find this "we" very interesting. He could have just said "I." After all, it's the very first sentence, and we don't yet know who this "we" is. But it was crucial to establish that this "we" is what the novel comes down to. We all want this "we" to be part of a group, to believe that we're in it together with someone. Our desire for this is so strong that even when the group is all smoke and mirrors, as is the case with these characters, we still want to root for them or seek a sense of belonging with them because of that "we." We get more confirmation that this is the case for Richard too, when he says, "This strange quality which attracted him to them, far from being natural, gave every indication of having been intensely cultivated. Studied or not, I wanted to be like them." Now, sure, you can argue that what he means by this is that he too wants to be wealthy like they are. But I don't think that's all it is, or else he could have just said that. No, there's a certain charm to these characters that Richard fully knows is not real, but he idolizes them so much, he's willing to not only perform for them, but with them. He'll take part in the charade because he hopes that at some point it'll become real, but of course we know that that will never be the case. But he keeps trying to impress them, even with things that aren't even impressive. Like when he gets punched in the face, he says, "I told Francis that the FBI man had done it just to watch his eyes get round." While the Clique are Dionysus for us, I think they're also Dionysus for each other. For example, Bunny changed his major to ancient Greek because it was Henry's major. And when Richard first sees the group up close, he remarks, "Two of the boys wore glasses, curiously enough, the same kind." They are all constantly in a loop of trying to impress each other while also trying to be like each other. And this admiration they have for each other, this desire to be known as a group, is what makes me wonder, would Bunny have cared about the murder of the farmer if he had been with them that night? Would he have cared if he had felt included? Even Henry seems to think he wouldn't have. He tells Richard, it's not that his conscience bothers him or that he feels any compelling kind of moral outrage. He thinks he's been somehow wronged by the whole business. He feels injured, excluded. When the weight of this secret becomes too much and Bunny starts breaking down while talking to Richard, he can't help but taunt him a little. "You don't even know what the devil I'm talking about, do you?" he said with an oddly nasty tone in his voice. He's still trying to hold on to this shred of belonging to the group that he knows isn't real, but he doesn't know that Richard also knows that. Going back to my point about Richard viewing this group as characters, not real people, I think it's because of his perception of them as almost godlike that he derives a certain perverse joy whenever something bad happens to them or whenever they do something immoral by society's standards. For example, when Richard asks Francis whether he thinks Charles and Camilla ever sleep together, and he says yes, Richard thinks to himself, the thought of them together brought along with the predictable twinges of envy, scruple, surprise, another very much sharper one of excitement. I think this excitement comes from the fact that he holds these characters to such an unrealistic standard, which he desperately wants to reach but knows he can't, so he gets a perverse joy at the thought of them falling from grace. This thought or reaction he has happens at several points, like when Camilla tells Richard about Charles's abuse and he kind of gets confirmation that she's not into him. He thinks, everything for a moment was unstable and radiant as a dream. I felt a fierce, nearly irresistible desire to seize Camilla by her bruised wrist, twist her arm behind her back until she cried out, throw her on my bed, strangle her, I don't know what. Getting rejected by Camilla in this moment is so painful for Richard because it reminds him once again that he will never truly be one of them. So he feels he has to punish her to hide his embarrassment. His relationship with the group is built on a cycle of veneration and envy because he knows he cannot be like them, so a part of him rejoices whenever they're in trouble or in pain. Like when Charles and Henry were to appear in court together and Camilla was obviously upset. Richard notes, in a certain perverse way, I was pleased at her distress. I'm sure that at some point in this story, we've all found ourselves wondering the same thing Richard does. Why, of all people, had they chosen to tell me? At the end of the book, we finally get the answer when Richard says, because they couldn't have done it without me. Now, obviously, he's talking about Bunny's murder here, but I also think you could interpret it as they couldn't have upheld their facade without me. I mean, think about it. Richard is the observer. He's the one through which we get to know these characters, and we already know that his narration about them is not to be entirely trusted. As I mentioned at the beginning, I think they knew how highly Richard regarded them and kept him around for that purpose, to be perceived by someone who either believes your performance or admires you enough not to call you out on it. It's certainly something special. So I think Richard became their god in a way, in that as long as they could convince Richard that, one, the murder of the farmer was picturesque, and two, Bunny's murder was necessary, they'd be able to convince themselves. It's so interesting watching each of them almost kiss up to Richard after Bunny's murder or be afraid that he'll no longer like them, like how Francis was when he was in the hospital with Richard and worried that Richard was mad at him. Francis's snide expression faded. "You're mad, aren't you?" he said anxiously. "No." "Yes, you are." "No, I'm not," I said. These sudden panicky attempts at conciliation annoyed me more than his insults. They need him there, otherwise they'll have no one who won't think they're horrible people for what they did. I want to quickly make a case for us, the readers, being the group's Dionysus. This idea came to me when I read this one paragraph where Richard was actually talking about Julian. He says, "He refused to see anything about any of us except our most engaging qualities, which he cultivated and magnified to the exclusion of all our tedious and less desirable ones, while I felt a delicious pleasure in adjusting myself to fit this attractive if inaccurate image, and eventually in finding that I had more or less become the character which for a long time I had so skillfully played, there was never any doubt that he did not wish to see us in our entirety, or see us, in fact, in anything other than the magnificent roles he had invented for us." Is this not how we too view these characters? Don't we also glamorize the characters so that the images we post of them or the aesthetic we've created surrounding them excludes their negative traits? In that way, I think that we too encourage their performance in a way because we too, like Julian, don't want to see them for who they are, because it wouldn't align with the glamorized aesthetic they represent for us. Even though Tartt had been dropping hints from the beginning of the book to show us that nothing is as picturesque as it seems, it's not until after Bunny's murder that this becomes explicitly clear, mainly because Richard starts to slip up in his narration. No longer is his perception of the others and the things they've done blinded by his admiration. For instance, Richard admits that while the thought of growing old with the rest of the group, of being united by the secret, once comforted him, now it made me sick, knowing there was no way out. I was stuck with them, with all of them, for good. He also stops being able to glamorize the murder, to turn it into something cooler than it actually is. For instance, this is how he describes Bunny's funeral. A green striped canopy of the sort used for lawn parties was set up over the grave. There was something vacuous and stupid about it, flapping out there in the middle of nowhere. Something empty, banal, brutish. Somehow I had thought there would be more than this. I was starting to see everything all at once with a blistering clarity. Later on, he also admits that the murder was a selfish, evil act. This deglamorization, if you will, occurs with Julian as well. After Julian finds out about the murder and Richard sees his reaction, he finally says, "It was as if the charming theatrical curtain had dropped away, and I saw him for the first time as he really was. Not the benign old sage, the indulgent and protective good parent of my dreams, but ambiguous, a moral neutral, whose beguiling trappings concealed a being watchful, capricious, and heartless." Which brings me to the question I raised earlier. Why is Richard even telling us this story? Personally, I think it's his last attempt at absolving himself of the guilt he feels. If he can convince us, the readers, that what they did is picturesque, that it can be aestheticized, then maybe, just maybe, we won't view him and the rest of the group as the selfish, immoral people they really are. In the John Adams talk, Tartt says of herself, "Things are always more palatable to me if they're presented in entertaining form." Let me again start out by saying that I cannot stand Henry. Truly, I never found him smart or charismatic and can't for the life of me understand why he's such a favorite among fans. To help us look through the facade that is Henry's character, I've compiled a list of his faults and or generally stupid things that he's done, because I need you all to jump on the Henry hate train with me. Number 1, he is low-key racist. At one point, Bunny mentions that he tried to get Henry to come down to Jamaica with me, but he said there was no culture. Okay, moving on. Number 2, he's not as clever as the other characters and us think he is. During a conversation with Richard, the twins admit that the idea that both Richard and us, the readers, had cultivated of all of them, but especially of Henry, up to that point of them being super smart, Oxford-bound students, is not real. "Hampton's the last place on earth," said Charles. "For the worst people in the world," said Camilla, laughing. "Half the people here are here because nowhere else would let them in. Take Henry, for instance. If Hampton hadn't let him in, he probably wouldn't have been able to go to college at all." I'm not mentioning this to make fun of them or suggest that they're stupid or that you have to be Oxford-bound to be considered smart. Not at all. I merely bring it up to show that they are not as academically inclined as we've made them out to be, to fit the dark academia aesthetic. This is also where we get the truly iconic line that Henry refused to take the SATs because he's got some kind of aesthetic objection to them. Like, that is so fucking funny. What? These people are deeply unserious. Number 3, he keeps a journal where he details the bacchanal and murder of the farmer. Not only that, but he takes it with him to Italy, knowing Bunny would surely try to read it. Not only that, but he writes about Bunny in the journal because he doesn't think he'd be clever enough to figure it out. Except that the name he gives Bunny in the journal is Annoying Rabbit in Latin. What do you mean you didn't think he would be able to figure that out? Like, huh? Number 4, he has no respect or sympathy for other people, especially ones he perceives as less than. For example, this is how he starts telling Richard about the murder of the farmer, saying, "This is where I come to the rather unfortunate part of my story. He feels no shame, no sympathy, no guilt over taking the life of another person. He merely views it as an inconvenience. This is later confirmed at the end when he has this conversation with Richard. "You don't feel a great deal of emotion for other people, do you?" Henry asked. I was taken aback. "What are you talking about?" I said. "Of course I do." "Do you?" He raised an eyebrow. "I don't think so." "It doesn't matter," he said. "I don't either." He goes on to describe how he felt killing the farmer, saying, "My life for the most part has been very stale and colorless, but then it changed the night I killed that man. Now I know that I can do anything that I want." Number 5. He has no loyalty to people unless they're useful to him. At one point, Cloak tells Richard he thinks Henry might be trying to pin Bunny's murder on Richard. I don't know what the hell he told them, but he was trying to point them in any direction but towards himself. Like what direction? Like me. And I hate to say it, but I think towards you. Of course, you could argue that Cloak is lying, but at that point, I don't see why he would. I also think it's very plausible for Henry to do something like this, so I'm personally inclined to believe Cloak. There are a lot more things I could talk about, like Henry wanting to poison Bunny with mushrooms, but I'm honestly sick of talking about him, so I'm going to move on. I'll just end by saying Tartt really does not leave room for us to glamorize these characters, especially Henry, but I think it's a testament to how well she wrote these characters, how convincing their facade is, that it's so easy for us to find them charming or to be fooled by them. While I have no problem with people who love this book and who have a casual liking or enjoyment of these characters, given everything I've talked about, the thing I have issue with is the rampant romanticization of these characters and especially of the lifestyle they lead. And yes, I know I've just spent the last part of this video talking about why I think it's understandable for people to have formed an attachment to these characters, but what I don't think is understandable is when this attachment turns into blatant glamorization and promotion of things that shouldn't be promoted. There has been an increased glamorization of hedonism in dark academia circles based on its depiction in this book that I think is really disappointing. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's wrong to want to prioritize one's own happiness and pleasure, but that in itself is usually not the way hedonism is practiced, and it's certainly not the way it's practiced in this book. The way hedonism is practiced in this book is inherently unconscionable, since it is taken up as a way of numbing one's guilt and shirking one's responsibility to others. The characters use hedonism to, 1, justify the murder of the farmer and subsequently the murder of Bunny, 2, justify the relationships they want to have with each other, i.e., Richard wants Camilla, so how dare she not want him, 3, justify stealing other people's property multiple times, 4, justify not keeping up with world news or politics or anything that doesn't personally affect them, and 5, justify treating others badly if they don't help cultivate one's aesthetic, which is how Richard and the others treat Judy and Cloak, etc. This is what hedonism looks like in this book, and this is the behavior that people, perhaps unintentionally, are propping up when they promote a hedonistic lifestyle. Yes, sure, the academic aesthetic of it all is also something that gets frequently romanticized, but it's not the main thing. The main parts of this book that I've seen being romanticized are the bacchanal, the drinking, the smoking, the degeneracy, the self-indulgence, the prioritization of the self and of the group to the neglect of others. And I know this because I frequently see people commenting under creators' posts, "That's so Camilla," and insert one of the male characters. And what is so inherent in these comments is the desire to have what these creators have, to be part of their group, to live like they do, to be a hedonist. Of course, it's worth discussing why young people nowadays are leaning towards hedonism as a coping mechanism or lifestyle, but that's beyond the scope of this video. But I will say very quickly, one reason for this move towards hedonism, in my opinion, is because a lot of us don't have we don't have a tight-knit group of friends. We don't feel like we're part of a community. and this can manifest itself as hyper-individualism or hedonism. It is my opinion that being a reader is antithetical to being a hedonist, at least in the way it's portrayed in this book. I think if the empathy for others that you develop while reading begins and ends with fictitious, morally gray characters, then that's really unfortunate. Being a reader necessitates caring for others. It necessitates learning from other people's perspectives and imagining oneself in other people's shoes. And it's these values that we should be taking with us into our daily lives, not hedonism, which teaches and requires us not to care about the needs of other people, to not care about people whose existence doesn't benefit us, to ignore the fact that there are people around the world being oppressed, starved, and killed. The characters in this book need hedonism to continue to justify their selfish existence and the crimes they've committed, which is why they go to such lengths to continue living in their bubble of pleasure. Because if it were to burst, if they had to care about anything or anyone but themselves, the facade of being carefree, self-sustaining hedonists would quickly fall apart. All this to say, please stop comparing real-life people to these characters. It's weird and frankly offensive because, again, these characters are losers and the lifestyle they lead isn't anything to aspire to. I know that people don't have bad intentions when making these comparisons, that more often than not, they're appreciating the beauty or aesthetic of a creator's content rather than actually comparing them to murderous, corrupt people. At least I hope that's what it is. But even in this case, I'm really reminded of what George Laforgue tells Richard about Julian at the end of the novel. There is nothing wrong with the love of beauty, but beauty, unless she is wed to something more meaningful, is always superficial. It is not that your Julian chooses solely to concentrate on certain exalted things, it is that he chooses to ignore others equally as important. This also relates to a quote from Martel's book, where he says, "My belief is that given the political terror and cultural upheavals of the last 120 years, the only function beauty, in the traditional sense, can hope to have today is a cosmetic one. Beyond that, it only serves to perpetuate the illusions of a former age in our own, even if the realities these illusions may have concealed are now in plain view." It's fine to want to aestheticize reading, to imagine what these characters would look like in real life, but if all we're taking away from this book and others like it is the beauty or the aesthetic, then we seem to be going down a very superficial path. I believe we inevitably become selfish, shallow beings when we focus solely on beauty, whether it's the beauty of others or the pursuit of beauty. I fear that the over-aestheticization of this book is setting a precedent for not only what future dark academia books will look like, but for what bookish content as a whole will look like. And I worry that it means aesthetics will become more important than content. Ours is a hyper-aesthetic age, a time of phantom images and blinking lights, manufactured memories, and synthetic dreams. If you enjoy a creator's content because it's so The Secret History coded, ask yourself what that actually means and why this creator seems to be leaning into the aesthetics of this novel so heavily. Are we using the dark academia aesthetic as a way to show our love for the novel and its themes, or is the beauty of it a purposeful obfuscation meant to disguise the fact that we're afraid to show who we really are, or worse, that we have nothing real to say? Even though I've been rambling about this book for however many minutes this video ends up being, I don't necessarily think I had a good time while reading it. I had fun annotating it and coming up with the interpretations for this video, but it wasn't a fun read, if that makes sense. I don't think I have the same connection with this book that many people seem to have. I'm not sure if it's because I waited too long to read it, so I've already been influenced by and gotten kind of sick of other dark academia books. But regardless, one thing remains true, and that is that Donna Tartt is a brilliant writer. Truly, I love Donna Tartt's writing so much. She is one of my favorite writers, by which I truly mean wielder of words. Her sentences don't just exist to lead into the next one. No, every sentence is a work of art in itself. She really luxuriates in and takes her time with the vocabulary she uses, and it's so beautiful to behold. I'm also famously not a fan of description, but there were some descriptive passages in here that had me awestruck and that I reread multiple times because they're so cleverly and gorgeously written. Let me read you some of them. So this is on page 120. It's during the chapter where Richard is stuck in the snowstorm. She writes, "When I walked home at night, things got white around the edges, and it seemed I had no past, no memories, that I had been on this exact stretch of luminous, hissing road forever." And then this is on page 121. "At night I lay shivering on the floor, watching the illuminated snowflakes sift in a column through the hole in the ceiling, on the margin of stupefaction as I was sliding off the steep roof of unconsciousness. Something would tell me at the last instant that if I went to sleep, I might never wake. With a struggle, I would force my eyes open, and all of a sudden, the column of snow, standing bright and tall in its dark corner, would appear to me in its true whispering, smiling menace, an airy angel of death. But I was too tired to care. Even as I looked at it, I would feel my grasp slackening, and before I knew it, I had tumbled down the slanted edge and into the dark abyss of sleep." And yes, I do think this book is a modern classic, and I do think it should be taught in university. It's a great lesson on media literacy and unreliable narrators, and I definitely do think it's a book worth reading with an open mind. All this to say, Judy Poovey, you will always be famous.